All right, good morning, everybody. I'm grateful to Mr. Mark for taking the class last week and leading us through another portion of Genesis, but I'm glad to be back and to be back in the study with you all, back from afar. I was thinking a lot on our study in Genesis, and I was reminded of kind of the metaphor that I talked about last week. I said as we read this book together, it feels a lot like riding on a tour bus together. I thought that was a really accurate way of understanding how this study has been going, or where we're at in this study. We're on this bus together, and the driver is not me, and it's not you, it's someone else, but he's taking us through a place that we should, or that most of us have probably already been before. Maybe some people haven't been to this place. But as we're going, he's pointing things out, and us being there before, we're pointing things out. But overall, together on this journey and on this ride, we're hopefully nonetheless noticing new things about this place, but overall trying to figure out where it is that we're actually going and what it is that the driver truly wants us to notice in each place. So I thought about this as every time that we come back to the themes that we've been looking at, the thing that I think the driver's trying to point out for us is, at least in some way, the origins of really everything, of how we got here and why things are the way that they are, the problem of sin that we see reoccurring in pretty much every narrative that we've read so far, and what felt like a kind of a new kind of theme that showed up, specifically with the perspective changing from everyone to a specific family, is the importance of family and the promise that comes through that one family. With that being said, there's another kind of metaphor that came to my mind as I've been reading Genesis. It not only feels like a bus tour that we're kind of going through, but it also feels like an old man story. The one that you kind of, you know what I mean? You talk with your grandfather and he sits you down and tells you some old family story. Or I think the other way I thought of it is the How I Met Your Mother story, or How I Met Your Father story, how you first ran into them and things like that. It's a story of how you got here. When your parents are telling you that story, they're like, if these things didn't happen, you wouldn't even be here. But in that same sense, it gives these important highlights about someone specific to you and someone specific to your life and something important that they may have done. We learn these new significant things about our predecessors. And that's the same feel that we get in Genesis. That's how we relate to this book. When we become Christians, as people, as righteous people who live by faith, we become children of Abraham. So when you read Genesis, we're not reading about strangers, but about people to us who are in some sense not strangers, but family. We started out the book by saying that there's a primary audience and there's a secondary audience. The Jews, who this was initially written to, would have been the primary audience, and we're the secondary. While we're the secondary, there's still an application for us. When we think about becoming children of Abraham ourselves, we become closer to that primary audience, if not that primary audience itself, children of Abraham. So we're reading the stories of our patriarchs in that sense. I think that's a really cool thing. So today, as we look at Genesis, we're going to be in chapters 24 to 27. That's a lot to cover, and so we're going to be just trying to hit specific portions of those chapters, but chapters 24 to 27 is what we're in today. We focus on different aspects of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all the way down to, all the way from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and Esau. And so the first place we're going to start is in chapter 24. Chapter 24 is an interesting one because it actually left me with a question that I've asked with just about every chapter that we've looked at, which is, why is this here? I think some chapters are more obvious. You get the Table of Nations that tells us why every nation is here. We get the covenants with Abraham that tells us the different aspects of the promise. But chapter 24 focuses on the process of finding a wife for Isaac. Abraham takes his servant, makes him promise, makes him swear to go to his homeland, the land of his brother Nahor, I believe it's called Haran, and to find Isaac a wife there. And so while it's an interesting story and a cool story and narrative that we're reading here, I was wondering, okay, but why is the driver pointing this out? Why is he making a note of this specifically? What do we learn from this chapter? Well, kind of going back to the themes that we've been discussing so far, you get the how we got here. It tells you important aspects of how Isaac and Rebekah got together. But the thing that I pulled from chapter 24 the most is the loyalty of Abraham's servant. I think as a kid, as a teenager, when I read this text, I focused on the marriage aspect and said, okay, as a person that wants to get married, I should pay attention to what's happening here with Isaac and Rebekah. But now reading it, I think the thing that I pulled out the most was how this servant of Abraham acts. So let's quickly run through just a couple aspects of chapter 24. The first thing that I noticed about Abraham's servant is that he's motivated by a promise. He goes to this land and everything that he does is motivated by this promise that he has made to Abraham. It's on the forefront of his mind, and it seems like it's the only thing that he's talking about. But he's motivated by two promises at once, really. The promise that he's made to his master, but also the covenant and the promise that he knows is between Abraham and God. So, let's see here. In Genesis chapter 24, we see that he's motivated by a promise that's on the forefront of his mind. And the other thing I notice is that he calls on God to guarantee his success in fulfilling this promise that he has made. In Genesis chapter 24, in verse 14, he says, and excuse me if it sounds a little bit different, one of the blunders of Rome is that I left my Bible there, and it's in the process of being sent back. So while some of the text may show up as ESV on the screen, I'm reading from the CSV. It says, let the girl to whom I say, please lower your water jug so that I may drink, and who responds, drink, and I will water your camels also. Let her be the one who will appoint for your servant Isaac. Be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. And so it's interesting because the servant goes to God and he says, okay, Lord, I need to figure out what's going on here. If you do this, then I will know this. And it's important for us to understand that the servant isn't testing God here, but as we see some Jews actually do in the New Testament, he's asking God for a sign. It's really him going to God for some type of guidance. And what I love about this is that I think every time that I ask for something and pray for something, I normally assume that I'm going to receive it over a long period of time or that it's just going to take longer than I expect it to. But I don't think that's always the case based off of the example of what happens with this servant. Because when he asks God for this sign or for this guidance, God answers him quickly. It's before he can even finish saying what he says that what he asked for comes to fruition. Go ahead, Lorenzo.
Just to make a connection to our Wednesday night Bible class, when this man prays, he prays to Yahweh.
Yeah.
And I know that we were talking about the fact that the Lord made himself known in Exodus chapter 3 by giving his personal name, but Abraham and even his servant are already using that name at this time.
Yeah, it's really cool because it also demonstrates that, in a sense, I would think that this isn't just a relationship between Abraham and God that this servant is working off of, but a relationship between himself and God that he's working through. And tells me I should have or should be doing the same. There's this personal aspect that I learned from this servant specifically. I think that's cool. Such a humble person in Abraham's household, we can still pull from his example. So he's motivated by this promise. He calls on God to guarantee his success. And he's, in that same sense of talking to Yahweh, thankful for everything. Whenever anything comes to fruition in this plan or in him wanting to fulfill this promise, he goes to God and he thanks God for everything that happens. For example, in verses 26 through 27, when he sees that his sign has been given to him and his prayer has been answered, it says, the man knelt low and worshiped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not withheld his kindness and faithfulness from my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the journey to the house of my master's relatives." Later on in verse 52, it's another place that we see him thank God. And once he sees that Rebekah's family kind of agrees to what his purpose is there, he does the same thing. When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed to the ground before the Lord. I wonder if it was in that moment, literally as they're talking to him, that once they agree to give over Rebekah, that he bows down and praises God right then and there. So again, he thanks God for everything, recognizing that his success isn't from his own doing. And it also just demonstrates gratitude. He's grateful for what God is doing for him. So the last thing I want to point out about this servant that stuck out to me is how much he prioritizes his mission, how much it obviously means to him. He's on a mission. I don't know how else to put it. In Genesis chapter 24 and verse 33 specifically, I think it demonstrates that well. The man refuses to eat before his mission is fulfilled. He says, a meal was set before him, but he said, I will not eat until I have said what I have to say. And so it just, again, shows the devotion of this servant. Let's see here. We see something similar in verse 56, something that when I read I thought felt kind of extreme, but I think it's something that we could still have an appreciation for. In verse 56, it says, he responded to them. The family, when they decide to give over Rebekah, says, let us have 10 days. Just 10 days with her before we have to say goodbye or let her go. And the servant pushes them on this. In verse 56, he responded to them, do not delay me, since the Lord has made my journey a success. Send me away so I may go to my master. So again, he's prioritizing his mission. He's not letting anything be a delay to him. He doesn't even want to allow Rebekah to stay any longer so that he fulfills his purpose and fulfills his promise. He wants to have no reason to delay in what he's meant to do. Perhaps this servant learned this type of loyalty from his master, from Abraham. Perhaps you looked at Abraham's relationship and learned from that and applied some things to his own. Because Abraham is one who is also quick to service. We're told oftentimes where there are other areas where he may struggle or may need to do better. When God tells him to do things, Abraham tends to just do it. In another sense, we see that Abraham is someone who's also motivated by the promise. One thing I've been trying to emphasize as we've been going through Genesis is that God is always reiterating and bringing back up his promise to Abraham. Because I think at first, Abraham doesn't get it. But once we see that Abraham's been blessed with the promised child, Isaac, I think he starts to act differently. The faith that we see on Mount Moriah is a faith that I think is different from what we saw before when Abraham is laughing at God. And so I think once he realizes the aspects of the promise, he then becomes motivated by it in a new way, in the same way that I think we see from his servant. But then we see that he works quickly and diligently and does what he's told, just like this servant does. So again, this is the aspect of Genesis that is that how I met your mother type story. We see from our father Abraham and from a servant in his house how to be a good servant. Like Abraham and his servant, being fellow members in that family and being fellow members in God's family. So that's the big things that I saw from chapter 24, and I wanted us to just take note of as we're going through this. Go ahead, Mr. Judy.
I just wanted to say something about Rebekah.
Sure.
When she says, here's some water for you, and I will water your camels also. Scripture says that there were men with him. Let's say there's 4 or 5 men. Plus him, that's 5 camels. The average camel, just to get its whistle wet, is 10 gallons of water.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of water for her
Yes.
to dig. Well, nerves. She's a wonderful person.
Yeah. I hope everybody heard that. We're talking about a lot of water in terms of how much Rebekah would have been given over to not only this servant, but the other men that were there and all these camels. Like, I think we think of it as, I thought of it as just the jar that she's carrying, but it would have been a lot of trips or a lot of moving around of water to make sure these people are taken care of. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because those are the kind of things that we want to focus on in a Bible study is I try to make sure that we're focused on the geography to say, hey, think about how far people are traveling or where they are when these things are happening, or again, the numbers and the abundance of what's going on. It demonstrates something important about Rebekah, which we'll touch on a little bit more, or again in a little bit, but she comes off as a very generous person or a selfless person. She comes off as having a servant's heart from this first interaction. All right, let's continue on in chapter 25. This chapter kind of focuses on death and life, really. I'm trying to think about the best way to put it. It focuses on Abraham's death, and it brings up new life concerning Esau's birthright specifically and how Jacob and things are involved with that. So this chapter begins with the death of Abraham. We're told that he dies at the age of 175. And we're also told that aside from Hagar and Sarah already, Abraham takes on another wife named Keturah and has sons through him. So I'm very grateful for Mr. Mark last Sunday and the class that he taught. I sat down and watched that and was glad to be sitting at his feet again. A lot to learn from him as a teacher. But I saw we didn't get to talk about chapter 23 a lot, which is okay. It's one of the chapters in terms of the many that we have to read in Genesis that I'd encourage you to read on your own to have that understanding of it. But it goes into Abraham going to the land of the Hittites to bury his wife Sarah. He buys land there and he buries her there. And again, it was one of the chapters that I read and kind of questioned, like, okay, why is this here? It's historical in the sense of what happens with Sarah, but what is trying to be pointed out to me here? And again, I think it's another aspect of the how he got here type story. Because not only does Sarah end up there, but Abraham ends up there. And a lot of other people, as we go through Genesis, end up in that same place. So this just land, this one plot of land becomes very important in that sense. And again, going back to this metaphor of the old family story, if you went to this land in the Hittites, wherever this might be, if we literally went there today, it'd be cool to think that we wouldn't go there as strangers. It's like you're visiting a family member or the grave of a family member. You'd know who this person is. Oh, Abraham and these other people were buried here. My mind immediately got actually taken back to the Rome trip. As we were there, we went to Circus Maximus, where we knew that other Christians had been martyred. We went to the catacombs, where we knew that other Christians had been martyred and got to worship there. Did we know those Christians by name? No. Did we know those Christians personally? No. But were we strangers to them? No. In the sense that we were a part of the same family and had the same cause and could go there, in some sense, not as strangers. And again, it touches on, I think, the point that Genesis is trying to make for us in connection to these other people. So the more people that get buried here, will get buried here as we go through Genesis. That happens in 23, but it comes up back again in this chapter of 25. So now I kind of want to focus or shift our focus a little bit, because in the next three chapters, in this one, 25, 26, and 27, we start to see some interesting patterns amongst this family. We haven't even gotten in the text yet to Jacob and Esau, yet we've already mentioned kind of patterns that we've seen in this family that we're reading about through the book of Genesis. And that is specifically in terms of talking about Abraham and these sons that he has. When they're talking about Keturah, this new wife that he has, we're told let's start in verse 4. Chapter 26 and verse 4. Am I in the wrong chapter? I am. There you go. Chapter 25 and verse 4. It says, "And Midian's sons were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, Eldah, and all these were the sons of Keturah. So Abraham gave everything he owned to Isaac. But Abraham gave gifts to the sons of his concubines. And while he was still alive, he sent them eastward away from his son Isaac to the land of the east." I hope people can already see the connection I'm trying to make here. Do you see a pattern in terms of what Abraham is doing? Maybe not something that maybe not something that has happened before him, but something that is going to happen that reflects what he is doing here. Abraham has all of these sons, but he gives everything that he has to one son specifically. Kind of shows a little bit of favoritism here. You got Bashir?
Not really. This is his true son.
It is his true son. I think it's different with Abraham in a sense that it does seem like he's keeping the promise in mind in terms of what he's doing with that one son. However, even with the subject of polygamy and things like that, I think the fact that Isaac is the only promised son and the only son that God said he was going to have Abraham to have, it suggests that these other sons that came about we know they weren't a part of God's plan, or at least they weren't a part of the covenant. And so even in terms of Abraham keeping that in mind, these other sons are around because of Abraham's doing. And even if he is sticking to the promise, I'd assume that they'd feel some type of way about Abraham giving all of his things over to Isaac and then him saying, go away, go somewhere else. And I mean, if he just remembered what God said and stuck to just Isaac, any type of feelings that would have been had there wouldn't have happened. But in that same sense, I think he is just doing what he's told. He is trying to make sure that Isaac is the one who's in this promised land that he knows from the covenant. But in that same sense, I think the way that he deals with his children, I think is reflected later on, even in Jacob and Esau. But let's continue on. In verse 5 and 6, chapter 25. Let's see. Okay, sorry. No, this is the point that we just reiterated. So I think what we see this reflected in Jacob in terms of how he deals with his sons. I think we see it reflected in Isaac and Rebekah and how they deal with their sons. Either way, the way that they're dealing with their kids causes some issues here. Okay, let's continue on in verse 19 through 28. Chapter 25, 19 through 28 says this. These are the family records of Isaac, son of Abraham. And Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took as his wife Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Paddan Aram, and the sister of Laban, the Aramean. So Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. And the Lord was receptive to his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. But the children inside her struggled with each other, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two people will come from you and be separated. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." And when her time came to give birth, there was indeed twins in her womb. So one came out red looking, covered with hair, like a fur coat, and his name was Esau. And after this, his brother came out, grasping Esau's heel with his hand. So he was named Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. When the boys grew up, Esau became an expert hunter and outdoorsman, but Jacob was a quiet man who stayed at home. So Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for wild game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, actually, we'll stop there. We'll get into that in a minute. The thing I want to point out is it talks about Rebekah and Isaac. And again, we see another pattern there. At least one thing I wanted to stop and nest in as we're going through this quickly. We see another pattern. We get told about Rebekah that she is barren. But who else do we see being barren in the book of Genesis? Sarah's barren. Rachel starts out barren. I think it's pretty interesting, isn't it, that God chooses a specific path through which this covenant is going to come through. And that path involves a lot of women who are barren. Pretty interesting considering that that covenant involves many offspring, right? And that a certain someone is going to come through those offspring. It's a repeated pattern that we see here. And it brought me back to the names of God study that we've been doing on Wednesday, specifically the name of El Shaddai, God being the one who is almighty, in a sense, the one who breaks nature, the one who overcomes all obstacles. It's God bringing Israel again through the impossible. So, again, the text brings up Esau. And what I wanted to, again, go back to our Wednesday night studies is not only the names of God, but the how we study the Bible, studies that we had previously. We talked about how the Bible sometimes introduces characters. So I want to do that same thing with some of the characters that we see get introduced here. So it brings up Esau. What does Esau's name mean? Red. Esau's name means red. And how is he described? Hairy. Right? A hairy man, an outdoorsy type man, really just a go-getter. He's described as this big, red, hairy, great hunter. And I think even his first words express how we probably think of him, right? In Genesis 25 and verse 30. What does it say the first things he says is? What's he looking for? What's he about? What's the first words he says? He wants food. I thought about the movie Bug's Life when reading this text. The grasshoppers show up and they literally go, "Where's the food?" Like that's what I thought about with Esau. He gets back from hunting, right? He's covered in hair. He's been outdoors all day, and his first words, "Where's the food?" He comes off as a little bit brutish, right? But like a manly man's but a brute. I think that's interesting. I think it's important as to the rest of the story. We get told a little bit about Jacob as well. What does Jacob's name mean? I'm hearing a couple things. What's his name mean? Usurper, heel grabber. And that's literally interpreted as like a trickster, someone who trips up somebody else. Because as they're coming out of the womb, right, Jacob is grabbing at Esau's heel. It's interesting, because I don't think this always happens, but in the story of Esau and Jacob, a lot of the things that Jacob does is foretold even in his birth. He's pulling at his brother's heel, pulling his brother back and holding him back. So how is Jacob described? I think when I've read this text, I've always focused on mainly what his name means, but not how he is described. How is he described? He's described as quiet, and where does he dwell? Where does he spend his time? At home. Intense. He's like the opposite of his brother, which I think is another important thing to point out, is that they're kind of opposites. Which is also interesting because I remember doing a sermon on this. They're twins, right? They're born at the same time. So it's interesting that they were born together, but they are so extremely different and would probably play into the conflict that we see between the two of them. Yes, Ms. Gail?
I was going to say, I always thought it was interesting that Isaac loved Esau more.
Yes.
He was a man's man.
Yes.
The father's dream.
Yeah, it's the boy that the father would want, right? Yeah.
The hunter and man's man, and then, of course,
Yeah.
Esau, Jacob more.
Yeah.
So, which happens.
So when reading the text, I normally would stick to remembering the fact that Rebecca had this favoritism for Jacob, but would forget the fact that Isaac had this type of love specifically for Esau, and it's funny that it's kind of based in food. Esau could make really good food, and so Isaac favored Esau for that reason. It goes back to the saying of, if you want to, how is it? The quickest way to a man's heart is through his stomach, right? So it is really funny, isn't it? But even in terms of how Abraham is doing it is, again, with the promise in mind. I think one thing that this tells us about family, or that we should remember, is how our kids feel in terms of how they deal with each other. Because when you show that type of favoritism to them, or when they see that or something like that, it causes problems. I think that is just a fact, and that we can see from the text. And again, we see Jacob is named heel grabber, trickster, usurper. He's described as someone who is, and again, some not overlook, he's quiet. He's a quiet person and a tent dweller. It may even point out to the fact that when he's speaking with, very much so with a purpose. What is the first things that he says? It's in chapter 25, it's in 31, and verses 31 and 33. I think I have this on.
Jacob says, first sell me your birthright, and Esau comes and says, hey, I'm starving.
Yes, yeah. There's some urgency on both of their parts, right? Esau shows up and he says, where's the food? I'm hungry. Give me some of that stew. I need to eat now. And Jacob says, sell me your birthright now. Swear it to me now. Go ahead, Leanne.
I was going to say, it kind of makes me think of in the New Testament where the one brother, he asks his father for his inheritance.
Yes, I think that's a really good example, is when you have the prodigal son and the prodigal son and his older brother. They both have the sense of when they come to the Father, the things that they want it now. This is the pattern with sin. People see, they want, and then they take. And I think you see that in the urgency of what Jacob is doing here. When does he want this birthright? He wants it now. Jacob's name comes from this aspect of him twisting things his way. But I think it's not just an emphasis on the heel grabbing in this sense, but also the grabbing specifically. He wants it and he's taking it. He's going to get what he wants in any way that he can. Right? So he's taking things and he's putting them into his own hands, which is already a pattern that we've seen through Genesis. God tells people how he expects them to do things, how he wants them to do things. But just like his grandparents before him, Abraham and Sarah, they said, we're going to take things into our own hands, which has caused some of the problems that he's dealing with in this moment right now. So, I think it's important for us to know, the last thing in this chapter I want us to note before we move on to the next one, is the very last thing that is said. I'm pretty sure this is the last in the last verse of this chapter. You say you have, you know what it is? You want to share?
Thus Esau despised his birthright.
He despised his birthright. In terms of family, I think this book is teaching us a lot about family. I think in general we need to be considerate about how people feel and the things that our actions do, how they impact people and affect people, especially our family. Because more than anything, I think one of the things this narrative is pointing out is as time goes on and on and on, Esau is building up in hate. He's getting more upset and more angry, and while he should be careful about how he's acting in the midst of that, it's not like it's unwarranted, right? Jacob is actively doing things to antagonize his brother, and essentially he's not thinking about his brother at all. Think about another brotherhood relationship that we've already thought about and how this may relate to it. Oh, go ahead, Ms. Christine.
I think it's just interesting that I totally get you when you talk about family, because when it says the children struggled together within her, even in her womb, they were fighting. Could you imagine this poor mother who was giving and loving and so generous to everybody else, and now she has 2 children that bicker constantly, probably all the way through their youth, teenage years, and everything. And then it doesn't say if she was in the room when he came in there, but I'm sure she was probably in the house, and just that, I'm hungry. Well, okay, but give me your birthright. Could you, as a mother, I'd be like, what are you doing? Like,
Yeah.
what are you 2 doing all the time?
Yeah. So it's actually interesting that you say that. I'm gonna put a note in that. You would think that based off of the conflict that she sees between the 2 of them, all she'd want is for them to get along.
Right.
But I don't know if that's what we see. So I'm gonna put a note in that really quickly. I'm going to try to make sure that we just note some things about chapter 26. Isaac is the promised child, right? And one of the things that I know Craig has pointed out specifically in his sermons is that we see that the covenant has built up to him for a long time. This narrative that we've read in Genesis so far for chapters has built up to the birth of Isaac. We see that Isaac almost gets sacrificed, but we don't ever hear him really say much about that. And we don't actually get told much about Isaac. But in terms of all that, this is one of the chapters where we hear the most about him. We get a whole chapter about him. God comes to him and reiterates his promise to him like he does to Abraham. And we're told that his reason for, this is something that I thought was very interesting. We're told his reason for multiplying Isaac is because of Abraham's obedience. We're told, if you look at verses 1 through 5, he says, I'm doing this to you because of Abraham's obedience. And I was like, is that fair? I mean, it's not about anything that Isaac is doing. He's being multiplied because of what Abraham does. And I thought that that was definitely foreshadowing the Christ, of pointing to Christ in that sense. Because I think you can listen to that and say, how is that fair? But we reap the benefits from that same type of reasoning in the sense that we are rewarded for Christ's obedience. That same thing applies to us. We continuing on. In verse 26 and verse 7, we see that Isaac makes the same mistake that his father Abraham did, right? Which is dealing with Abimelech. And I don't know if this is a different Abimelech or the same Abimelech. We're dealing with a king named Abimelech who Isaac goes to and lies about who his wife is in the same way that Abraham does. And he makes the same mistakes that Abraham does. Important thing to point out. In verses 12 through 16, we're told that Isaac is blessed with much wealth, just like Abraham is. So much so that the king Abimelech is kind of challenged by the abundance that Isaac has. It's interesting because Abimelech is a Philistine king, or they're in the land of the Philistines right now. And so it's interesting to think about how Isaac deal with the Philistines and Abimelech, to think later on how David deals with the Philistines. In verse 28 and 29, we see that people, like they did with Abraham, recognize, and think about yourself in terms of this situation, if people respond to you in the same way. When Abraham goes places, like in chapter 23, with the land of the Hittites, they recognize him as a follower of God, or a prince of God. And they do the same thing for Isaac. I think that's just interesting. In your daily life, as you're going places, having interactions, making deals, do people recognize you as a child of God, or a follower of God? I don't know. It's just an interesting thing that was pointed out to me. He's going to these pagan nations, these other nations, and even they know the connection that he has with God. Okay. So kind of going back to that pen and pulling it out, in chapter 27, we get more about Jacob, Esau, Isaac, and Rebekah. Let's look at chapter 25 and verse 28. 28 says, Isaac, reiterating something that we read before, Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for wild game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Again, I want to read that again because we're starting to see a pattern here of kind of, again, favoritism. Whatever the cause is or whatever the reason is, it causes a lot of problems in the family. So we're talking about Rebekah and how she responds to the conflict between her sons. Does anybody know what Rebekah means? We always want to do this when we're studying the text, especially as we're reading Genesis, but in other places. When you see a new character, a new name come up, try to look up what their name means. Rebekah's name means to join, to tie, or to snare. It's essentially, it almost has like a rope meaning in terms of tying things together, tying things up. It can, and I think that can be, there can be a positive spin in that sense of joining things together, and there would be a negative spin in the sense of like ensnaring someone, entangling someone, or tying them up into like a trap or things like that. When Rebekah first gets described, do you remember how they describe her, the physical description of Rebekah? She's beautiful. She's described as someone who's very attractive. And then, again, we're saying her first words when she shows up is, "Drink, my Lord." She has these thoughtful words. It sounds like she has a servant's heart. So at first, Rebekah seems like quite the catch. In the same sense, I want us to notice the first introduction that we have to not only Rebekah, but to her family. Laban is kind of similar to her in terms of his first words. His name means white. And the only thing I want to point out about that, I don't know if there's huge significance. I just thought it was ironic that some of the people that Jacob will wrestle with the most in his life are named after colors. Esau is red, Laban is white. And these are the two people he seems to have some of the most conflict with. But continuing on, his words are like Rebekah. When he sees the servant of Abraham, he says, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord." They both recognize how godly this servant is, and they try to help him. But later we learn that Rebekah and Laban are both kind of tricksters. And not only do they really take advantage of people in certain ways, they both take advantage of their family specifically. Rebekah's name means to ensnare or to snare, right? And I think that makes sense because she's behind the trick that we see on her own husband and her own child, right? So in terms of hearing things specifically, hearing about their bickering, one thing she does hear is what Isaac intends to do with Esau, which is to bless him. So she makes a plan to make good food for Isaac and to make Jacob seem like Isaac, so Jacob receives this blessing. When Isaac hears about this, he's upset. When Esau hears about this, he's upset, and he reaches this point of saying, "I am going to kill my brother." But what I want to point out is that Rebekah trips up not only her own husband, but her own child. She doesn't seem like this is her first rodeo when it comes to tricking and ensnaring people. And I think this may be where Jacob learns it from. But the strife between these two brothers, again, what relationship do we see? Have we already seen strife between brothers? Cain and Abel. Let's look at chapter 27. Look at verse 41. They may be simple words, but these words spoke out to me. Again, think about who we describe Esau as and think about how resolved he is in terms of the words that he said. Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. And Esau determined in his heart, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother." The scripture itself says that Esau was determined. He says, "I'm going to do this." We have another brother relationship. And just like the first one, we see that in that brother relationship, there's division because of sin. I think some of the things that feed into that is the favoritism that we see between these parents, but also the lying and the stealing from one another amongst the literal immediate family. It causes problems. The sin comes into the picture again, this problem of sin, and it divides brothers, it divides family. Not only Rebekah, I don't mean to kind of just get on her specifically, but everybody in this family really, don't seem to have a regard for each other as family. When I was reading this text, I was brought back to what Cain says to God. Am I my brother's keeper? And the implied answer from God is yes. And when we act in a way that isn't reflective of that, we're feeding into that problem of sin. So, I think one thing I want us to look into, as we're running out of time, is interesting is that we talked about this theme of how we got here. We're told about different nations that show up in this text. With the nations of Lot, or the children that come from Lot, Moab and Ammon, they become these great nations that end up causing a problem for Israel. In Deuteronomy 23, we're told about how they hire Balaam to curse Israel. Edom is similar in this sense. Not only is Esau called Esau, but he's called Edom. They both mean red. Esau was hairy and red. He loses his birthright to a red stew. Not only like Moab and Ammon, but the nation that comes from Esau, Edom, is much like them. They're essentially relatives or family to Israel, but they grow into this nation that has a lot of great power, and they use that power to attack or weaken their brother. If you look at Numbers chapter 20, just like Moab and Ammon, a lot of times these brother and sister nations refuse entry to Israel. Sometimes they attack Israel. Recently, I did a sermon on David and David being on the run from Saul and how this man named Doeg, I don't know if this is ringing any bells, this man named Doeg comes and he helps Saul find David. In the process of that, Saul asked Doeg to kill several priests because his own men won't do it. Doeg is an Edomite. So think about that again in the sense of what tribe David comes from, and then, Doeg coming from the Edomites and again causing problems for Israel and the king of Israel. But the point is, Edom eventually becomes an example in the Old Testament and in the prophets specifically of a bad nation. So when we read about how much this nation of Edom specifically hates Israel and causes problems for Israel throughout the biblical story, we should be reminded of the hate that Esau feels in this verse for Jacob. So in this last moment, what do we learn from this? The big thing that I learned or pulled from these chapters is the influence and the importance of family. These families that we read about in Genesis grow to be these great and very powerful nations. But they end up doing these awful things to each other, forgetting their origins and forgetting who they are and where they came from. The very things that Genesis reminds us of. In that same sense, Abraham's family makes the same mistakes over and over and over again. And perhaps that's because family's example, or the example that family gives, is more influential and more impactful than we think. Maybe in more ways than we even understand. So I think it's no coincidence then that God thinks the family is so important, that he's emphasizing it in that way and uses it as a tool. It becomes apparent that God uses family to bring his very promise about. And it's no wonder. I think about 1 Timothy in terms of the qualifications that's given to an elder. And one of them is that an elder is supposed to be able to manage his household well. And I think that makes sense, again, if we're looking at the impact that the family has on the church and the world in a godly way, or if we want to have an impact on the church, on the world in a godly way, one of the places we may consider doing that is specifically with our family. Keeping our family in order and making sure that one of the first places to be godly is our family. I think that doesn't just apply to blood. Well, it does apply to blood, but not blood in the sense of just our immediate family, the blood of Christ that unites and joins us all. Again, we think about the things that we do to each other and the actions that we take. We have to be considering others when we do that, because why would you just wrong your brother in that way? You have to consider the actions of Esau and the actions of Jacob, the actions of Rebekah, Isaac, what they do to their family and the problems that it caused, the sin at the heart of that. Anyway, again, consider family and the importance of family, the tool that God uses it as. Not only your immediate blood, physical family, but your spiritual family as well, in terms of impacting each other and impacting the world. All right, read up on chapters 28 to 36. I know it sounds like a lot, but again, that's what we're going to be focusing on next Sunday. 28 to 36, make sure you're well read in those chapters. Thank you for your time, everyone, this morning.